Good afternoon. I'm Nazlee Maghsoudi, and I will be presenting on a systematic review about the implementation of drug checking services for people who use drugs. Drug checking services allow the public to submit drug samples for chemical analysis and then provide the results of that analysis back to them in order to facilitate more informed decision-making around their drug use. Drug checking services originated in the late 1960s and early 70s in California, and then proliferated throughout Europe in the 90s, primarily in party settings. Most recently, drug checking services have been adopted in other jurisdictions, primarily in response to new psychoactive substances, or NPS, including synthetic opioids. And that is certainly the case in Canada, where drug checking has been adopted in response to the proliferation of fentanyl in the unregulated drug market. Now, drug checking services use differing models around the world, and technologies have different benefits and drawbacks. And a key difference between technologies being used by individuals independently and drug checking services is that services will typically also offer harm reduction consultation and tips along with the provision of analysis results. In addition, services will aggregate analysis results in order to provide insights into the unregulated drug market and thereby offer benefits and information beyond those using the service directly. Given the growing availability of drug checking services and the interest in their impacts, we sought out to conduct the first systematic review of original research, and particularly focused on 3 domains, which were derived and prioritized based on consultation with experts and knowledge users through the Canadian Research Initiative in Substance Misuse. And these included, first, the influence of drug checking services on the behavior of people who use drugs; second, the monitoring of drug markets by drug checking services; and third, outcomes related to the models of drug checking services. We did register our review protocol in Prospero, so you can find it online if that's of interest. With respect to our methods, we searched 8 databases using mesh terms and keywords for peer-reviewed articles and peer-reviewed conference abstracts between the time period of 1990 through to October 16th, 2019, and we had no language restrictions. We also included gray literature reporting on the influence of drug checking services on behavior, and we identified those through online sources. We also restricted our studies reporting only quantitative or qualitative data, and that meant that we excluded other types of studies, such as commentaries or letters to the editor. We also notably did search reference lists of included studies. With respect to our inclusion criteria, I'll note here that we use the PI framework, and for the intervention, we had no restrictions on the drug checking service based on the types of technologies that they use to analyze drug samples. Turning to the Prisma flow diagram, where I will speak about methods, but also begin to speak about our results here. 2 independent reviewers began by screening 2,463 titles and abstracts, and any deemed relevant by at least 1 reviewer advanced to the next stage, in which both reviewers independently screened 156 full texts in duplicate for inclusion. Data extraction was then conducted on the 90 studies that met inclusion criteria, and that was done in duplicate by both reviewers. While not on the flow diagram, we did assess study quality for 13 peer-reviewed articles in duplicate, and those were ones that met a priori criteria of reporting on quantitative data about either behavior or models of drug checking services. Now, conflicts at each stage were resolved by consensus between the reviewers, and there was input from the last author as required, who also triple-checked data extraction and quality assessment for 10% of studies. We used narrative synthesis for our analysis, and our outcome measures were not pre-specified, but were inductively coded in an iterative process throughout data extraction. So moving into our results, the study characteristics for the 90 included studies in the systematic review, as you can see on the slide, most, specifically 72.2% of the studies were from Europe. With respect to the domains, monitoring of drug markets was most commonly reported, followed by the influence on behavior, and then lastly, outcomes related to models of drug checking services. And with respect to study designs, most used cross-sectional studies, and that is specifically 87.7% did so. Now, turning to the outcome measures within each of the domains, beginning with the first, influence of drug checking services on behavior of people who use drugs. This captured both behavioral intentions and enacted behaviors. So intended behaviors were either in response to actual analysis results from a drug checking service or hypothetical results. And these were assessed in 24.4% of studies. Enacted behaviors were either observed or were self-reported historical recall, and those were measured in 17.8% of studies. And studies found that intended behavior, and although less researched, enacted behavior were changed in response to analysis results from drug checking services. And that was more often the case when results were unexpected, so differed from what the individual submitting the sample thought the drug contained, or contained drugs of concern. With respect to the monitoring of drug markets, you can note here that my x-axis has changed. And this is, of course, because the majority of studies did look at this domain. So within this one, concordance measures were conceptualized as the first two of expected substances detected or unexpected substances detected. And those were reported in 61.1% of studies. Other common outcome measures here include the detection of NPS, as well as the detection of drugs of concern. With respect to outcomes related to models of drug checking services, the most common outcome measure here was facilitators to the use of drug checking services, followed by barriers to use. So studies concentrated in Europe and focused as a result primarily on people who use drugs in party settings. However, there was also an emergent evidence base on structurally vulnerable people who use drugs, and that was coming primarily from the United States and from Canada. As noted, drug checking services provide a unique form of drug market monitoring, including on the level of concordance between what was expected and what was detected in drug samples, as well as on the detection of NPS and drugs of concern. Emerging evidence demonstrates that drug checking services do influence behavioral intention and, to a lesser extent, enacted behavior, and that's most common when results are unexpected or drugs of concern. With respect to the strengths of the systematic review, the comprehensiveness is a key benefit. We achieved this through the inclusion of studies since 1990, and this was reflective of the proliferation of drug checking services since 1992 in non-English speaking countries, which is also why the inclusion of all language was a really important strength of this review. The comprehensiveness was also achieved through the inclusion of gray literature and peer-reviewed conference abstracts. Now, a couple limitations that were linked to resource limitations were that we only reviewed gray literature on the influence of drug checking services on the behavior of people who use drugs and not for the other domains. And we did not appraise the quality of gray literature or of qualitative studies or studies reporting exclusively on drug market monitoring. So in conclusion, the monitoring of drug markets by drug checking services is well established in Europe and increasingly in North America. And there is an emerging evidence base on the capacity of drug checking services to influence behavioral intention and, to a lesser extent, enacted behavior among people who use drugs. Now, further research on enacted behaviors, as well as linking behaviors to health outcomes, and among other subpopulations of people who use drugs, such as people who inject drugs or people who use opioids, would be an asset to the knowledge base, as would more rigorous and higher quality study designs, because we found that those studies for which we assessed quality were not of particularly high quality, and this was often due to cross-sectional designs and behavioral intention measures that are subject to the intention behavior gap. As drug checking services gain popularity, ongoing evaluation across different settings will be really critical to understanding their impacts and the limitations of this intervention. So I acknowledge the financial support provided by our funders, as well as support from CRISM, as well as, of course, the land on which this research was conducted. I thank you for your attention and look forward to questions and comments.